Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today, as you may have deduced by the title of the video, we're going to talk about spadroons. We're going to look at this, we're going to look at this, and we're going to look at this. Now, the inspiration for this video came from an image by Nick Thomas of the Academy of Historical Fencing, in which he shows, let's say, the evolution of the spadroon in 3 phases. And, well, I'm lucky enough to own one sword for each phase, more or less. So, well, unfortunately, they're not in the correct chronological order. This would be it, from oldest to newest. So I thought, while the image is super useful and it's a reference that was very useful to me in understanding spadroons better, maybe a video version of it where we actually get to see the swords live too can be an equally interesting source of information. But beyond that image, I also wanted to talk about a post Nick wrote in which he talks about the misconceptions around spadroons and how they get this often negative rap because they're considered fragile, useless swords and a bit of a evolution of a small sword, which kind of, for some weird reason, gives them a negative vibe. I assume that comes from the fact that military swords, people expect them to be they would rather have them derived from some broad, heavy, hefty sword used to destroy in the battlefield rather than what is felt as a court sword or something that's a bit more delicate and more of a uniform piece than a practical piece. However, Nick points out in the post he wrote, and I agree with him, so that's why we're going to talk about it. This is really not the case, and the spadroon has its own dignified history that people should recognize and learn to appreciate. So the first point Nick makes in his video is the rebuttal, I guess, of the often held position, although perhaps it's changing now. There's been a wave of spadroon revivalism, I suppose, but there's still this idea that the spadroon is an upscaled small sword. And this, I think, when people think of a spadroon, they often think about this kind of sword. This is a probably German clone of a British 1796 pattern spadroon, which is the infamous spadroon that everyone hated and which caused that claim from an officer at the time of it being an encumbrance. I don't remember the exact quote, but it's the famous quote about terrible spadroons. So what people think often when we think about spadroons is this small sword style hilt, often with a flimsy foldable shell with the double shell guard and a straight blade that people assume is not good either for thrusting nor for cutting, and is, yes, scaled up compared to a small sword, but it's probably not good enough to hold the dangers or the hardships of the battlefield. Well, Nick's position in this, and I have to say I completely agree, so I won't repeat it throughout the video because I really agree with everything he says, is that this is a incorrect position, not just in the sense that, for example, we need to reevaluate, that the spadroon wasn't that bad, or that, hey, we're maybe being too strict on the spadroon and how it performed. It's more on a fundamental position, I think he disagrees, which is the fact that the spadroon and small sword have 2 separate and parallel developments and evolution. So far from this being an upscaled version of the small sword, this is a completely different sword that by chance and perhaps by fashion of the time shares some aesthetic characteristics with what a small sword would be, but it is in no way, shape or form a development from the small sword. So let's take a look at what Nick describes as the key points, let's say, in this parallel evolution of small sword and spadroon. Well, around the 16th century, we start seeing a shift, he says, to smaller, more easier to carry swords with simplified hilts. So there can be many reasons for that. I haven't researched it in depth, but I can assume one of the reasons might be growing armies and the need, for example, to begin pre-industrial mass production, let's say. So you start having to value ease of production, obviously the efficiency of the sword as well. But let's say swept-hilt rapiers and big, broad, mortuary hilted swords might not be anymore what is enough to equip a modern army for the time. This is my feeling. Anyway, his point is that when we talk about this parallel development of spadroons and rapier and small swords, is that the small sword develops from the rapier. So it basically becomes a scaled down and simplified version of the rapier. So a long, mainly thrust-focused sword. Whereas the spadroon is a scaled down version of other sorts of sword, specifically, for example, Walloon hilted swords or mortuary swords, for example. So those broad, heavy, hefty, battlefield-ready military swords that were used, well, before spadroons came to be. So the point here is that the spadroon is a military weapon. It is not an upgrade of a civilian weapon or of a court sword that has been adapted to kind of work on the battlefield. It is, in all senses, the evolution of efficient and effective military weapons developed for use in its specific time. And I think some of the negative reputation spadroons have comes from perhaps a certain element of classism, let's say, almost reverse classism in a sense, whereby the spadroon is considered a bit of a gentlemanly weapon, one that was not necessarily used on the battlefield, so perhaps was more of a part of the uniform, almost a decoration or an ornament, but not really made to be functional. And I think many collectors, when looking at swords, appreciate the value on the battlefield of the weapon too, not just its decorative use. It's a bit like the difference between who loves to collect wall hangers, but the majority of sword collectors goes for practical, battle-ready, or original weapons. But again, this is an incorrect assumption. The weapons through which the spadroon developed were not fancy rapiers, let's say, or gentlemanly swords. They were troop swords. They were munition-grade swords very often. So if you look at, for example, and we can see it in the evolution of the spadroon too, by the way. Again, if we look at the Walloon-hilted sword, yes, Walloon-hilted swords, you can find some beautiful ones. Mortuary swords especially can be beautifully decorated and very fancy. But there are a lot of very simple, very basic munition-grade swords of this kind. Just imagine the civic guard of the Dutch town swords. Sometimes those are referred to, for example, as Walloon swords. Those are swords for a militia, for a troop. Yes, a rich militia for sure, but still they're not a status symbol for the wealthy necessarily, at least not in their manufacturing, maybe in their symbolism. Again, if we look at this basically spadroon, this early spadroon with a Walloon hilt, this was used by troops of the VOC, so the Dutch East Indies Company. This was not used by the governor of some colony in the faraway lands. This was used by the troops on the ship, off the ship, by the cannon fodder, let's say, of the time. So yeah, not a fancy weapon. Again, if you look at this, the 1786 British pattern, so the first official pattern of sword for the British Army. This is, yes, it's an officer's sword, but it's not a superior, it's not a general's sword. And even if you look at it, it's a very utilitarian weapon. It's not some kind of, nobody's going to court with this to be fancy and cool. And again, if we look even at the later versions of spadroons, so late late 18th century throughout the 19th. We see these are mass-produced swords, just as any of the others. If anything, other models are more fancifully decorated and gilded and blued. This is a rather utilitarian officer's weapon. So no, the spadroon, when you look at it, is not a civilian sword that has been kind of undeservedly upgraded to military function, but it is a full military sword in its own right. And at that, it's a trooper's sword too. Nick then goes into some detail about the practical functions of the spadroon, so its effectiveness both at cutting and thrusting. Now, I'm not a fencing practitioner, so I don't know about that. I trust what he says. But even just as an observer and just handling a few antiques, I have to say that all of these are sharp on the edge. And in my experience, I have to say that when a sword is not designed for cutting, it is not sharpened. They wouldn't put extra work, weaken a thrusting blade with an edge if they didn't expect it to cut. So the fact that these are sharpened, this one too, by the way, which is the, let's say, most recent of the three, makes me think that in the design of whoever planned these swords, these were definitely made for both cut and thrust. Now, I'm not discovering anything new, I'm just adding my 2 cents to Nick's point. But without diving too much into the practicalities of the spadroon, because of course I haven't used them practically, so I'm not qualified, let's say, to talk about it. I just wanted to quickly run you through the timeline of the spadroon using these 3 swords that I've been showing you in this video, but we'll take a closer look and kind of see the evolution over time, again, according to Nick's timeline. So let's get into it. Okay, and let's take a look at the 3 spadroons in the sequence Nick Thomas suggests in his image post. So what we see at the top here is the Walloon hilted sword, the scaled down version. He actually describes it as double-edged blades. Hilts are simplified versions of mortuary or Walloon type swords with or without back wand, a bar from the outside shell to the side of the pommel. So this would have been the back wand in this sword. So we know that it's not necessarily a fixed presence on these swords. You can obviously see the reference images he adds in his photo too. Now, as far as the time frame goes for these, he mentions between 1650 and 1770. So, as I mentioned in a previous video, this sword fits that time frame perfectly. It is dated to 1717. Characteristics of this specific one are a rather light and nimble blade and a rather heavy pommel that makes it, I don't know if I would say back heavy. Well, now obviously, I think I would actually say that. Its balance point is not even here, maybe here. So actually very, very close to the hilt. Obviously, I don't know, this is not the original grip, but if anything, it would have been even heavier because the original grip was wrapped in metal. So a grip heavy sword with a rather nimble blade. It is double-edged. It's still a broader blade than you see on the other 2, although it lightens up a lot towards the tip. So that's what we can say for this one. Now we can look at the middle phase Nick Thomas identifies. He describes it as usually single-edged, minimal hilt protection, usually provided by a slot or stirrup hilt, with or without side loop, additional outer protection on rare examples. He dates these swords between 1770 and 1810. So these actually have a relatively short lifespan, let's say. And I wonder if it's because of the minimal hand protection they offer. I can only imagine at some point they would have been redesigned. But if we look at this one, again, this one fits perfectly in the time frame Nick mentions. This is a 1786 pattern, British pattern infantry spadroon. And this one has a more narrow blade. So if we compare it here, not by much, but it's a little bit more narrow. However, the blade is slightly longer on this one, which is 32 inches, rather than this one. This one might be a couple of inches shorter. What we see here again is flexible. This one doesn't have a very thrust-centric tip, I would say, but it would definitely do the trick, and it's sharp up to, well, quite a bit down the way. It's sharp, so someone wanted to cut with this. Now, if we look at the balance point on this one, because this one is lacking that heavy pommel that we saw on the Walloon. However, this one also has a pretty heavy ebony grip here and this steel backstrap, which adds weight. So if we look for the balance point here, we see it somewhere here. So a little higher up, perhaps, in the Walloon sword, but still not tip heavy at all. Now, moving forward, we reach the third type of spadroon. So if you have Nick's image open there, please reference it. This is the late spadroon. So he describes it as typically single-edged with double shell guards. Service largely stopped with the British in 1820s, but continued elsewhere. And when we say elsewhere, we're often talking specifically about the German states. They kept using swords in this style until the late 19th century, until basically they're what were called alter art, so old style swords, were substituted for the famous IOD 89. And they kept existing even after 1899. So these spadroons in the German states were the weapon of choice for officers, I suppose. So let's see if this one matches Nick's description. This is also probably a German one. We can see now, well, sorry. First thing, the blade is slightly longer than this one, maybe 2-3 inches longer. So we're getting towards 35 inches, I would say, perhaps, of blade length. And it's a still relatively narrow blade, like very similar to the British one, with a fuller. And it's definitely single-edged. It has a bit of a false edge. Someone sharpened this side too, but not as much as the bottom side, so it matches Nick's description for sure. And what we have here now is a shell guard has been added. So we see, compared to that previous version, that we have now some form of hand protection. Although we have to consider that by this time, sword fighting is probably becoming, I mean, it's still happening, but becoming less and less prevalent. Definitely not as prevalent as it may have been in the times of the Walloon hilt, the early spadroon. If we look at balance point here, I have to say this is a very, very heavy grip and hilt, and this is because it's all brass. So even this whole grip here, it's not wood or anything, it's a full piece of brass. And if we look at its balance point, we're somewhere here. There we go. So in conclusion, what we can see here is a overview of Nick's spadroon typologies. We can see some definite differences, which probably show the need for hand protection, then a modernization that goes maybe a bit too far, and then a reprisal of at least minimal elements of hand protection that now are perhaps not as necessary anymore. And one interesting thing is their point of balance on all of these is rather hilt heavy, I would say. And for different reasons. In this case, it's the pommel. In this case, it's the whole assembly of the ebony grip, but it's even the blade that is extremely light. And for this one, it's the extremely heavy full brass hilt. So there we go. I hope you enjoyed seeing them on video. And there we go. We have the history of a sword that is perhaps now being appreciated again, but has gone through some definite misunderstandings and misconceptions over the course of a couple of centuries. And yeah, it's a sword that I find extremely fascinating in its, well, in its variety and diversity. So I hope you enjoy it too, and I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, stay tuned because, yeah, there's one coming out, I think, every week, more or less. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.